The Zimbabwe we know today wasn't born in peace. It was forced into existence through fire, blood, and betrayal. This is not the story of a nation that rose quietly. It's the story of a people who fought for their land and what happened after they won it. Before the headlines of hyperinflation, sanctions, and exodus, there was a war. Before Mugabe became a dictator, he was a revolutionary. Before Zimbabwe was free, it was Rhodesia, a state built on white minority rule and black exploitation. And what came next was Africa's most intense and relentless liberation struggles. A war that pitted guerrilla fighters armed with Soviet AK-47s against one of the best equipped white armies on the continent. A war where religion, tribal identity, Cold War politics, and personal ambition all collided. A war that would change the course of Southern Africa forever. This is the story of the Rhodesian Bush War and how the dream of freedom gave birth to a nation that still bleeds from its past. To understand Zimbabwe, we have to go back. Way back, to the ages of empire. In 1890, British settlers arrived under the British South African Company led by Cecil John Rhodes. His vision was simple: control as much African land as possible from Cape to Cairo. The region that would later become Zimbabwe was named Rhodesia after him, a land claimed, renamed, and redefined by force. White settlers took the best land, the fertile highlands, pushing Africans into what they called reserves. The economy was built on mining, tobacco, and forced black labor. By the early 1900s, colonial laws had stripped Africans of voting rights, property ownership, and equal pay. This was not just segregation, it was a system of economic enslavement. As years passed, African discontent grew, but any attempt to resist was crushed. When the Second World War ended and African soldiers returned home from fighting for freedom abroad, they began asking, if we fought Hitler's tyranny, why are we still ruled by the Brits? That question planted a seed, and in the 1950s, nationalist movements began to rise. Among the first were the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress, also known as the SRANC, and later the National Democratic Party, also known as the NDP. Both were banned by the white government. Each time one was shut down, another emerged, more radical, more determined. At first, they shared one dream: black majority rule. But their methods, ideologies, and tribal loyalties would eventually tear the movement apart. In 1965, everything changed. Rhodesia's white Prime Minister Ian Smith defied Britain and declared unilateral independence. He said there will never be majority rule in Rhodesia, not in 1,000 years. To Britain, this was rebellion. To Smith's white settlers, it was preservation. To black nationalists, it was a declaration of war. Britain imposed sanctions. The United Nations condemned Rhodesia, but the Smiths regime, backed quietly by South Africa and Portugal's colonial government in Angola and Mozambique, stood firm. That's when African nationalists realized diplomacy had failed. The only way to take back their country was through the gun. Two liberation armies emerged: Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, also known as ZIPRA, which was trained by the Soviets, which was strategic and conventional, and the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, also known as ZANLA, trained by the Chinese, rule-based and guerrilla in nature. Though their enemy was the same, their rivalry would define the future of Zimbabwe. By the late 1960s, both armies began infiltrating Rhodesia's border. The Rhodesian Bush War, also known as the Second Chimurenga, had begun. It was brutal from the start. Villages became battlegrounds. ordinary peasants, the backbone of the liberation struggle, were caught in between guerrilla demanding loyalty and Rhodesian soldiers demanding information. The Rhodesian forces were highly trained, supported by elite units like the Silius Scouts, Rhodesian Light Infantry, and the SAS. Their tactics were ruthless: pseudo-operations, ambushes, and massacres disguised as counterinsurgencies. Guerrilla camps across Mozambique and Zambia were bombed from the air. Entire regions were declared protected areas, meaning that locals were relocated, controlled, or killed if suspected to be helping the enemy. The Rhodesians called it counterterrorism. The people called it liberation. Behind the fighting, another war was taking place, a war of ideology. The Cold War had reached Southern Africa. For the West, supporting Ian Smith meant backing a white minority regime in defiance of global decolonization. For the Soviets and the Chinese, it was a chance to expand influence, turning Africa into a front line of their ideological chess match. So, while Zipra received Soviet tanks, anti-aircraft weapons, and formal training in Lusaka, Zanla received guerrilla warfare training, propaganda lessons, and Mayos discipline from Beijing. The dream of unity was slipping away, replaced by suspicion, tribalism, and political ambush. And soon, the war would reach its deadliest stage. By the mid-1970s, the Rhodesian Bush War was no longer a scattered rebellion. It had become a full-scale liberation conflict, a brutal triangle of Zanla, Zipra, and the Rhodesian security forces, each fighting for survival and legitimacy. But the deeper the war went, the clearer it became. This was not just a fight against colonialism, it was a fight for who would rule when the dust settled. So now let's look into the conflict between ZANU and ZAPU. The rivalry between ZANU and ZAPU wasn't only political, it was tribal, ideological, and personal. ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, drew most of its support from the Ndebele-speaking population in the southwest. It envisioned a unified army, organized and disciplined, backed by Soviet advisors and trained in conventional warfare. ZANU, on the other hand, under Robert Mugabe and the late Herbert Chitembu, was largely Shona-based, rooted in the rural east and central regions. Its fighters, Zanla guerrillas, believed in Mao's revolutionary theory of mobilizing the peasants. Both sides accused each other of betrayal, infiltration, and power hunger. Even as their men died fighting the same enemy, they refused to fight under one flag. In 1975, tragedy struck. Herbert Chitembu, ZANU's chairman and one of the most respected liberation strategists, was assassinated in Lusaka, Zambia. His car exploded outside his home. The Zambian government blamed ZANU. ZANU blamed Rhodesian intelligence. But one thing was clear: Chitembu's death deepened the paranoia. Dozens of ZANU comrades were arrested. Factions accused one another of being traitors. The liberation war had entered its most dangerous phase, where betrayal often came from within. After Chitembu's death, Robert Mugabe, who had been imprisoned in Rhodesia for over a decade, emerged as the new ZANU leader. He was sharp, calculating, and uncompromising. To many, he symbolized focus and discipline. To others, ruthless ambition. But under Mugabe, ZANU tightened its grip. Its military wing, Zanla, became more aggressive, expanding into Mozambique, whose independence in 1975 under Frelimo gave the guerrillas a powerful new ally. Now, let's focus on Mozambique. When Mozambique gained independence from Portugal, it transformed the liberation landscape. Rhodesia was now surrounded by hostile states, Zambia in the north hosting Zipra, Mozambique in the east hosting Zanla. For the first time, guerrillas had secure rear-based rights on Rhodesia's doorstep. From here, they could train, plan, and infiltrate the eastern border with ease. The Rhodesian regime responded with overwhelming force. Operation Dingo, Operation Eland, and countless air raids were launched across the border, targeting Zanla bases at Chimoio, Nyadzonya, and Timbuya. One of the worst massacres came in August 1976 at Nyadzonya camp. Rhodesian forces disguised as Mozambican soldiers crossed the border and opened fire on thousands of unarmed Zanla recruits. Official estimates say over 1,000 people were killed, most of them young civilians undergoing political training. Rhodesia called it military success. The world called it a massacre. The war became darker with every passing year. For every Rhodesian raid, guerrillas retaliated with ambushes, mine explosions, and assassinations. Rhodesian farmers became targets. Guerrillas executed sellouts and locals accused of working with the regime. The countryside was soaked in fear, torn between liberation and survival. Rhodesia's government knew it was losing international legitimacy, so it doubled down on propaganda, presenting itself as a bulwark against communism. In Cold War terms, that worked. The United States and Britain publicly condemned Smith's radical policies, but quietly feared a Marxist victory in Southern Africa. Meanwhile, ZANU and ZAPU turned to global media to expose atrocities. Their fighters became symbols of African resistance, appearing in magazines, radio broadcasts, and revolutionary films. Every gunfight had a camera. The battle for hearts and minds was just as fierce as the battle on the ground. By the late 1970s, Rhodesia was exhausted. International sanctions crippled its economy, white soldiers were dying in growing numbers, and within the white community itself, doubt was spreading. How long could they really fight this war and win? South Africa, under the Prime Minister John Foster, began pressuring Ian Smith to negotiate. Apartheid South Africa needed stability on its northern border. The cost of supporting Rhodesia was becoming too high. Smith resisted, but the writing was on the wall. By 1978, the Rhodesian forces were fighting wars on two fronts, against Zebra from Zambia and Zanla from Mozambique, while trying to maintain control over cities, farms, and infrastructure at home. Zebra, equipped with Soviet SAM-7s surface-to-air missiles, shot down two civilian Air Rhodesia Viscount planes in 1978 and 1979. The incidents killed over 100 passengers combined, including women and children. The Rhodesian regime responded with a wave of reprisals, targeting refugee camps and guerrilla bases. The country was collapsing under its own contradictions. White supremacy could no longer sustain itself. In 1979, under the mounting pressure, Ian Smith finally gave up. He held talks with moderate black leaders in an attempt to create a multiracial government without surrendering full control. The result was the so-called internal settlement, which installed Bishop Abel Muzorewa as prime minister and renamed the country Zimbabwe Rhodesia. But the world refused to recognize it. Neither ZANU nor ZAPU had been part of the agreement. To the United Nations, it was still Rhodesia, still under minority rule. The real liberation leaders were still fighting in the bush. And soon, the war would reach its final act, a high-stakes negotiation that would determine who would lead the new Zimbabwe and what kind of nation it would become. By the early 1970s, Rhodesia had become a fortress under siege. International sanctions had cut it off from most of the world, but it still held on, powered by South African support, Portuguese colonial allies in Mozambique and Angola, and a fiercely loyal white settler military. But Beyond its borders, the winds of liberation were blowing hard. Mozambique gained independence in 1975 after Frelimo defeated Portuguese rule. Angola followed soon after. Zambia and Tanzania had already been free since the 1960s. Suddenly, Rhodesia was surrounded, not by friendly neighbors, but by revolutionary governments ready to arm, train, and shelter Zimbabwean guerrillas. By 1978, the war had reached a breaking point. Over 20,000 people were dead. The economy was collapsing, white conscription was at its peak, and young white soldiers, barely out of school, were being sent to kill or die for a system that was clearly unstable. Meanwhile, across the border, Robert Mugabe was rising. Mugabe wasn't just another revolutionary, he was strategic, calculating, and understood the power of image. While Nkomo Zapu maintained Soviet discipline and structure, Mugabe's ZANU exploited rural loyalty and religious fervor. He framed the war not just as a political struggle, but as a divine mission. He told fighters that they were fighting for the soul of the nation. That messaging worked. ZANU's influence spread rapidly through the eastern and central provinces, while ZAPU maintained strength in the west. The rivalry between the two wasn't just political, it turned violent. In some areas, Zanla and Zipra forces fought each other more than they fought the Rhodesians. Still, their combined pressure finally broke the colonial state. By late 1979, with thousands dead and no clear victory in sight, Rhodesia was collapsing under the weight of isolation. The turning point came with the Lancaster House Conference in London, a tense negotiation between Ian Smith's government, Mugabe's ZANU, and Nkomo Zapu, mediated by the British. After months of deadlock, an agreement was reached. Rhodesia would return to British control temporarily, elections would be held, and the country would finally gain recognized independence. For many, it felt like freedom was finally within reach, but underneath, the seeds of future conflict were already growing. The guerrilla armies would come home, armed, traumatized, and divided. The British would oversee a fragile transition, but without mechanisms to heal the deep wounds of war. And Robert Mugabe, the man who had spent years in exile and prison, was about to take stage not as a rebel, but as a national hero. Zimbabwe was about to be born, but the peace that followed would be darker than the war itself. In 1980, Zimbabwe was born. A new flag was raised. The war was over. The nation had a new name and a new leader. Robert Gabriel Mugabe, a man once branded a terrorist by the West, was now celebrated as a liberator. The crowds filled Rufaro Stadium in Harare, cheering as Prince Charles lowered the Union Jack for the last time. For the first time in nearly a century, the country belonged to its people. Mugabe's message was clear: reconciliation. He promised peace to the white farmers who stayed. He invited his former rival Joshua Nkomo into government. He told the world, let's turn our swords into plowshares. For a brief moment, Zimbabwe was a symbol of what post-colonial Africa could be. There was optimism, infrastructure, education, and a thriving agricultural economy. But beneath the surface, the old divisions, ethnic, political, and ideological, never went away. The war had ended, but it had not healed. The new government was built on a fragile alliance between Mugabe's ZANU PF and Nkomo Zapu, but that unity was never genuine. ZANU dominated the new army and the civil service. Zapu's influence was systematically reduced. Mugabe's vision of Zimbabwe was not pluralistic. It was centralized, ideological, and absolute. He saw Zapu not as a partner in liberation, but as a threat to his control. In the rural West, particularly in Matebeleland and Midlands, Zipra fighters who had fought under Nkomo were demobilized but not trusted. Rumors of rebellion began to circulate. Weapons were found buried, some planted, others left from the war. By 1982, Mugabe accused Nkomo of plotting treason. He dismissed him from government, and then everything changed. In early 1983, Mugabe deployed a special military unit called the 5th Brigade to Matabeleland. It wasn't just another army division. It was a force trained by North Korean instructors, personally loyal to Mugabe and commanded by Parent Shiri. Their mission officially was to eliminate dissidents. In reality, it was to crush ZAPU's support base and neutralize Ndebele resistance once and for all. The operation was called Gukurahundi, a Shona term meaning the early rain that washes away the chaff before the spring rain. It was a chilling metaphor because to Mugabe's regime, the chaff was human beings. The 5th Brigade entered Matabeleland South in January 1983. From the moment they arrived, they treated every village as enemy territory. Men were rounded up in schoolyards and executed in public. Women were beaten, raped, and forced to dig mass graves. Entire families were burnt alive inside their huts. In Lupani, Tolotso, Nkanyi, and Silobela, villagers were forced to sing Zanu songs while soldiers opened fire. Bodies were left buried, scattered across the bush as warnings. Survivors remember being told, "You are all dissidents." There were no trials, no questions, and no mercy.
Uzuvuvuke so ukhukhumale uchawa so konka kwaphambili kwavolova kona isiphaqe baka kuze ukhukhumale ubone sokule dundu lelingaka so.
In the words of a priest from Bulawayo who later fled the country, said they killed teachers, nurses, anyone who was educated. They said they were enemies of the state, but all they wanted was peace. Their brutality was systematic. It wasn't chaos. It was organized terror. At Balangwe camp, people were detained, tortured, and thrown into disused mine shafts. Trucks dumped bodies into the pits and covered them with lime. Witnesses claim that soldiers held nighttime executions for weeks, with music blaring from speakers to drown out the screams. The international silence was deafening. The world said almost nothing. At the time, Mugabe was seen as a model African leader, educated, eloquent, and a symbol of post-colonial success. Western governments didn't want to jeopardize relations. The Cold War was still raging and Zimbabwe was considered a strategic ally. Meanwhile, neighboring leaders like Kenneth Kaunda and Julius Nyerere stayed silent, seeing Mugabe's purge as an internal matter. Even within Zimbabwe, fear silenced everyone. People who spoke out disappeared. Between 1983 and 1987, human rights groups estimated that over 20,000 civilians were killed, mostly in Ndebele, under the 5th Brigade's campaign. Entire generations vanished, but in the state-controlled media, it was described as counterinsurgency. By 1987, the massacres had achieved their purpose. Nkomo was politically destroyed, his supporters crushed, his army disbanded. The year Mugabe offered him a peace deal, the Unity Accord. It merged ZAPU and ZANU into one party, ZANU-PF. The killings stopped, but the trauma didn't. Matabeleland was left broken, economically, psychologically, and spiritually. No one was held accountable, no official apology was given. The 5th Brigade members were later integrated into the National Army and promoted. Mugabe's power was now absolute. He had united Zimbabwe through fear, not freedom. When asked years later about the massacres, Mugabe called Gukurahundi a moment of madness. But for the survivors, it wasn't madness. It was a message that opposition would never be tolerated, that tribal identity could be weaponized, and that the liberator had become the oppressor. Zimbabwe's independence, bought with so much blood, had birthed a new kind of tyranny, one that wore the mask of revolution. When the guns fell silent in 1987, Zimbabwe looked peaceful from the outside. The war was over. The opposition had joined the ruling party. The headlines spoke of unity, but underneath that silence was only fear. Gukurahundi had ended physically, but psychologically it never did. Villages in Matebeleland were left ghostly, schools empty, families were broken, mothers buried their sons in secret, children grew up never knowing their fathers' graves. For years, even to speak of what happened was dangerous. The name Gukurahundi was banned from newspapers, from classrooms, from memory itself. In public, people said, "We are one," but in private, they whispered the names of the dead.
Bazowushala phezulu. Bazowushanga phansi lapha kwebele.
The 1987 Unity Accord gave Mugabe what he wanted: total power. He became executive president and ZANU-PF became the single dominant force in Zimbabwean politics. Nkomo, broken and humiliated, accepted a ceremonial post as vice president. To many Ndebele people, that deal felt less like unity and more like surrender. For the next 2 decades, the regime built its legitimacy on the myth of liberation, rewriting history to paint Mugabe as the sole savior of the nation. State media glorified the Bush War, but erasing Gukurahundi entirely. In school books, it became a small disturbance. In national archives, documents disappeared. Even researchers who tried to investigate were threatened or exiled. The victims of Gukurahundi were denied justice and denied memory. As the years passed, the dream of independence crumbled. The farms once promised to liberation fighters became tools of political control. Land reforms once justified as restitution turned into violent seizures and corruption. By the 2000s, Zimbabwe, once known as the breadbasket of Africa, was starving. Hyperinflation spiraled out of control. In 2008, the currency became worthless. People carried billions of dollars to buy a loaf of bread.
Maybe.
Much.
Box of matches.
Yes.
Coke.
No.
How much is a Coke?
300 billion.
300 billion.
Yes.
Hospitals ran out of medicine. Teachers, doctors, and engineers fled the country. Millions crossed into South Africa, Botswana, the UK, and beyond, not because of the war, but because of what the war had left behind. The irony is bitter. The generation that had fought for freedom was now running from the government born out of that freedom. Meanwhile, in Matebeleland, the silence continued. The mass graves remained untouched, survivors aged in poverty, haunted by memories that were forbidden to share. Churches tried to start the conversation, small truth-telling circles, healing projects, reconciliation workshops, but government officials often disrupted them. Those who demanded justice were accused of reopening old wounds. But how do you reopen a wound that was never allowed to heal? Some activists estimate that there are over 5,000 mass graves still hidden across the region. Every rainy season, bones resurface. Children playing in fields find skulls in the mud. And it's as if the land itself refused to stay silent. Gukurahundi didn't just destroy lives, it reshaped Zimbabwe's entire political culture. It taught the nation that dissent equals death, that unity means submission, that power can never be questioned. That legacy carried through Mugabe's decade-long rule, through election violence, through intimidation, through the collapse of democracy itself. Even after Mugabe was removed from power in 2017, the trauma didn't end. His successor, Emerson Mnangagwa, was one of the men who helped oversee the Gukurahundi operation as State Security Minister in the 1980s. Today, he leads the same party, ZANU-PF, under the same ideology, protected by the same silence. For the survivors, that's the final betrayal. But despite all the silence, the people remember. In Bulawayo, activists like Ibetu Likazulu hold memorials, erect plaques, and risk arrests to honor the dead. Artists and filmmakers tell forbidden stories in poems, songs, and documentaries smuggled online. Families whisper their histories to their children so that even if the government forgets, the truth survives. In 2019, under growing pressure, Mnangagwa promised a national dialogue on Gukurahundi. He spoke of exhumations, compensation, and reconciliation, but for many, it felt like deja vu, another political performance. The graves are still unmarked, the files are still locked, and justice remains a dream. Gukurahundi was not an accident. It was not chaos, it was a system born from the logic of power that says some lives are expandable in the name of control. The same logic that built Rhodesia and later corrupted the revolution that destroyed it. It's a story of a people who fought for liberation only to be buried by the government that rose from their struggle. Today, when Zimbabweans cross borders in search of safety, they carry more than economic pain. They carry the ghost of what happened after independence, the unspoken history of a genocide that was never tried, the silence of a nation that cannot mourn out loud. But no matter how long it's buried, finds its way back, through stories, through survivors, and through memory. Because every revolution that forgets its victims eventually turns on itself, and every nation that hides its past risks losing its soul. This is the Need to Know channel, and thank you.